Welcome once again into the Radiopedia Reading Room, a podcast unconcerned with books or poetry, tasseography or palmistry. This is a radiology podcast. My name is Andrew Dixon, and joining me once again in the radiology oasis, haptic suit on and searching for Easter eggs, it's my co-host, Frank Gaylard. How you doing, mate?
Ooh, I like that. Ready Player One reference.
Yeah.
That's a rare example of a movie that, I mean, it's worse than the book, but it's not horribly worse than the book. And when I say that I read the book, I actually listened to the book because I haven't,
Yeah.
I mean, I read occasionally, but I don't know, the ratio is probably 20-1, maybe.
Maybe when you're on a holiday by a pool, you'll use a paper book, but other than that,
Maybe. But having Will Wheaton read things to you, you come to the realization that these professional narrators are way better narrators than you are, which shouldn't really come as a surprise because that's their job. But Will Wheaton's amazing.
I really enjoyed listening to that audiobook, and I really did not enjoy the movie, I must say.
Yeah. Well, Will Wheaton reads a whole heap, including a whole series of John Scalzi novels. Not Matt Scalzi from Radiopedia, but John Scalzi, the sci-fi author, which are so much fun to read.
I think he read the Martian as well, didn't he?
Yeah, probably did actually.
Yeah. Today's episode, we're going to listen back to a panel discussion that you recorded with James Hayes and Dimitri Amiras about a year ago for Radiopedia 2022. Frank, you remember that?
Vaguely.
So James trained as a radiographer and Dimitri is a radiologist, but both have their own little companies exploring the use of augmented and virtual reality in radiology. So James mainly focusing on radiographer education and allowing radiographers to simulate in virtual space the mechanics of acquiring radiographs.
Mm-hmm.
And Dimitri exploring the use of extended reality to allow radiology trainees to actually perform simulated CT procedures prior to doing it in meat space on actual patients. So yeah, that's the background for this episode and why I went for a Ready Player One augmented and virtual reality theme in the intro.
Well, I'm keen to re-listen to this actually, particularly in light of the, Apple Vision Pro announcement. But before we do that, you mentioned meat space. It's a very exciting meat-related update.
You see, I threw that one to you. I thought if I say meat, I'm definitely going to. It's like dangling a little bit of bait in front of you, mate.
It is, but we've got the US Department of Agriculture, which I don't know what they've got to do with vat-grown meat. But anyway, it's the Department of Agriculture granted its ever first approval of cell-cultured meat produced in the US to be sold in some selected restaurants. The two companies are, Good Meat and Upside Food. And both of them are growing vat-grown chicken muscle cells that they'll sell in San Francisco.
Sounds like a good place to start.
The change is coming, Dixon, any second.
Yep. Is that anything else to that news other than that's been approved?
No, I mean, that's a big thing, right?
Okay.
Like you've got animal tissue being grown in a Petri dish and that legislative powers are happy for people to eat it.
Yeah, I would have thought maybe the Food and Drug Administration would have some say on it as well.
No, agriculture, it's chickens.
Okay. All right, well, let's get into this week's podcast, Gaylard. So this was recorded live with you and James Hayes and Dimitri Amiras at Radiopedia 2022. A fascinating little chat with Gaylard taking a typically Gaylard-esque, considered and somewhat skeptical approach. So let's listen to that now, and then we'll be back in the reading room oasis at the end for another chat.
I'm now joined by James and Dimitri.
Hi, Frank. How you doing?
Thanks for those lectures. I found those really interesting, and as a bit of a geek, anything that involves a new gadget, I'm naturally drawn to. But at the same time, I can't help but remember that when I was a kid, we had the first VR interest that promised a great deal, and it seemed to be a solution looking for problems, and it turned out that no one actually had some really good problems that needed VR back in the 90s. And it all died away, and then we've had a resurgence now, and clearly the technology has matured a great deal. But I had the same experience. I immediately bought myself the PlayStation VR headset, and got really excited and played a few games, and then rapidly thought, you know what, I prefer doing this on a screen with a controller. It's more efficient. And so both of you mentioned in your talks that you have desktop versions of it or just screen-based versions. And my question to both of you, and starting with you, James, is how much of this do you think is VR or XR dependent, and how much of it is actually people who are passionate about teaching finding better modern ways of teaching that happens to be able to use these technologies, but that's not at the heart of what we're doing?
So, I mean, you make a great point. For a start, there's an expression I use that I say, well, there's a huge difference between gaming and training. And the virtual reality gaming world is a little underwhelming. The realism is there. You're immersed in something. I once played a game for 5 minutes where I was being chased by zombies. Shortly after that, I made sure that all of the doors in the house were locked, and I was terrified. So it is very, very real. Now, if you can take that and you transfer all of that immersiveness on all of that fidelity and realism, and you make yourself a hospital or a radiology department or anything in that area or a clinic, you're like, well, now we've got access to something that's immersive. What is available on the screen is just completely different to what is available in VR. There is something called room scale. So you've got the muscle memory. So you're moving a patient or you're moving a scalpel or a radiology machine by moving it, with your hands rather than clicking on a mouse.
And Dimitri, what was your experience between the virtual reality biopsy solution versus the on-screen version?
Yeah, so we started off with a HoloLens, which is a sort of head-mounted AR display. And the students, what was really interesting is that when the students started using it, they were kind of, first of all, blown away by the experience. So if you've not used the HoloLens before, basically it's like you're hallucinating and seeing something in front of you that feels like it's there. So that really grabs the students' imagination, and they get really into the process. And we got amazing feedback from that session. And similar to what you were saying, James, we kind of had to sort of try and pivot to account for how things have changed during the pandemic. And so that's where we kind of developed this desktop version of the same thing from scratch. And it was interesting because when we ran the sessions with this desktop version, there was the same kind of feedback we got about feeling comfortable with the procedure, feeling like they learned something from it. So I'm not sure. I think in my particular example, because we're doing CT biopsies, a lot of the inference is on 2D anyway. The CT scan is a 2D representation. And because they're actually using a phantom, they were getting that tactile feedback. I think in event their imagination kind of worked anyway. It'll be good for us. We're going to hopefully do a comparison and see what how it compares. But I think there's a real, the desktop versions have got real potential. And as you say, the technology is you're still using very similar technology, and it is replicating a lot of the same stuff. But there is that advantage. I know you're talking about your VR headsets, but that kind of immediate, this is actually really cool, it's exciting. It does get the students more focused on what they're doing, I think. But we'll see, we'll do some comparisons and see what the feedback's like.
So that's an interesting point you bring up about engagement of students, because whenever there's a new technology that comes out, the early adopters, almost by definition, are going to be people that are really interested and passionate about teaching and embrace these new technologies. And so you're going to get the best people creating these kind of early learning experiences. The students then are going to find them amazing and engaging, and then they get widely adopted. And the people who don't like to teach or who have been using the same slides from 1982, blue with yellow Times New Roman headings, they're going to use these technologies just as badly as they use PowerPoints potentially. How much do you think of the engagement relates to the immersiveness versus the fact that the people making the content are particularly, it's new content and it's different?
Okay, so I mean, you're right. There are always going to be problematic lecturers, in that they will not, they will not keep up their material, and in some ways, they are always going to hide in plain sight. What this does is it allows a lot of the students who are in those classes, and there's nothing they can do for the 3, 4, 5, 6 years. The virtual reality and the adaptive learning that gets wrapped around it, it really allows a lot of self-directed learning, which kind of gets around a problem that you might not have an enthusiastic lecturer. This at least gives the students the opportunity to really go out and push the boundaries, because like Dimitri was saying earlier, they can do it in their own time. I was talking about doing it off-site, or I think it was actually the other way around. It gives the students that capability and most students, let's face it, are there because they want to learn.
Dimitri, when you were showing the glued on QR co-registration dot onto the biopsy and just a screen, it made me think, this is something that can actually be deployed in places that don't have a research department or don't have the funds for a commercial enterprise. Because one of the worries, I think, with these new and amazing technologies is, in some ways, they can widen the gap between places that have the resources and those that don't. And so finding ways that you can adapt this to the least funded regions possible is really important. But it does mean that it has to be created in a way that can be implemented.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was kind of part of the pivot to doing it on a desktop and a webcam, is to see how widely implemented we could make it and how sort of low cost and low barriers to adoption. I think, you've got a webcam, you've got a computer, you've got some biopsy needles, otherwise there's no point learning how to do biopsies, and then you've got a printer. The software, we are planning to put the executable files on GitHub so they're readily available, and I don't think there's going to be too many barriers from that for most people who are working in a hospital. Most people have got access to all of that. The next point is that we've tried to make it so you get a bit more tactile feedback. So you may need to get a 3D printer to print out the phantom to do the biopsies from. That's another thing that places may not have. Or maybe we can have stuff where we get other people to print them and mail them out. I'm hoping that it'll have great adoption. So, watch this space. We'll let you know.
For all of us who work in academic or teaching centres and have been there for more than 10 years, you will see the natural accretion of administrative hurdles that various training institutions or accrediting bodies use to keep track of how students are training. And it would be nice to find ways of assessing competency in a way that wasn't bureaucratic, but was objective, measurable, and validated. And it feels like both the VR and the CT example that you had, Dimitri, could lend themselves to something like that, where to show proficiency at doing CT biopsies, you actually need to hit, these lesions under sort of test conditions, which you couldn't possibly do in the real world. Or similarly for radiographers, you have to take this set of x-rays in VR appropriately. Have these kind of examinations been validated in how they transfer the skills to the real world?
Yes, they have. And we can't touch that, obviously, as a commercial company. We maintain an arm's length. There are a number of papers published about both our software and other people's software now. We obviously can't, we have to maintain sort of an arm's length, if you like, from that. There's some quite early results out from a number of universities which shows that the students felt like they were getting better transfer of knowledge, which is a great thing, because if they're feeling it, that's usually, but also that the clinicians they work with in the hospital, that the students that they were getting after some terms using virtual reality simulation compared to those who hadn't been using it were better prepared. And that's really exciting.
And Dimitri, what's been your experience with the students having done a bunch of virtual biopsies when they actually do their first real biopsy?
So certainly the kind of structured feedback that we did on the course showed they were much more confident afterwards, and they felt like, oh my God, I'm getting to do stuff that I would, feel really scared about doing in practice. But yeah, we haven't got sort of firm data on like what the experience is for the trainers in the clinical stuff. I think that's a really exciting, interesting point to look at. And just to pick up this thing about assessment, there's lots of amazing, clever stuff you can do. You can do hand tracking, you can look at efficiency of movement, all that kind of stuff. And then what it allows you to do is then have differentiated training for your trainees. So if someone isn't so, especially with a practical task, isn't so practically minded, you like, you know what, spend a few more days on the simulator, and then we'll bring you in to do the biopsies, and you get better experience for the patient, better experience for the trainee. They don't have any stress about it, and as the trainers, you have an easier life as well.
Now, something that I wondered about during your talk, Dimitri, you had the augmented or extended reality of the perforator veins superimposed on the leg, and you also had this CT biopsy virtual system. It strikes me that one of the simplest and most useful applications of that would be superimposing your skin entry point and the angle at which you want your needle to enter on the patient when they're lying there in the CT gantry. Is that something that you think is fairly easily developed? Is it something that any of the vendors currently offer?
So they don't offer it at the moment, and I don't know if you saw there. I did show a few pictures from a paper from a team that actually did some simulations of biopsies and demonstrated the lesion, and then you literally just saw the lesion in the holographic world and pushed the needle in. In fact, on our biopsy app, we did have a virtual needle that was there and was like, this is the angle you need to take for like the first time users. So, it makes perfect sense to do something like that. And I'm not sure why the vendors haven't done that. I think they're trying to work on how many more slices they can put on their CT scanner at the moment.
Yes,
and how they can use AI to sell something. But yeah, it makes total sense. And actually, if you think about patient benefit, it wouldn't be hard to write a paper to show that you've got less complications once you have these devices in place.
Well, thank you both for joining me here, and thank you for your lectures. We're now going to take
Thank you to Dimitri and James, and to you, Frank, for that panel discussion there. I guess like a month or two ago, wasn't it, that Apple announced the Vision Pro, which looks like it contains some pretty amazing tech that wasn't available when this panel discussion was recorded. Do you think this will change anything in the VR, AR space, or is it still a solution looking for a problem, as you said?
I don't know. I'm so ambivalent about this. On the one hand, I love any piece of gadgetry and tech, and I know that I've got a real bias towards thinking that the new thing is awesome. But at the same time, I'm just not sure how relevant a lot of this stuff is for most of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of what we do is on screens, and mimicking 2D screens in virtual reality seems just a bit silly. I guess there are some niche applications like the moving around a space or moving a person, like a pretend virtual person, into specific positions, which is much harder to mimic in 2D environment. I don't know. Like when I was a registrar, we practiced doing ultrasound biopsies on a chicken breast with olives embedded in it. Did you ever do things like that?
Yeah. Was it lab-grown chicken?
No, this was torture chicken. And, there's a huge benefit to doing that, because the last thing you want to do is the very first time you're learning how to fire the spring-loaded core biopsy needle to be when you're 4 centimeters in some petrified patient's breast. So I think that's a huge benefit to it. And so there are going to be examples like that where VR can bridge that very early phase of training.
Mm-hmm.
I watched, I don't know what YouTube channel was talking about the use of simulators in F1 training.
Mm-hmm.
And Verstappen, yes, he loves the simulator. He spends an inordinate amount of time in the simulator and is one of the great simulator drivers out there. And Hamilton hates them and basically doesn't use them at all. Now, the last couple of years, maybe he should use them more. But the thing that he was saying was that when you're driving a real car, a lot of the information you're getting is non-visual.
Mm-hmm.
It's the feel of the car under you and how it slides around, and the vibrations and the feeling and the inertia change. Whereas practicing on the simulator teaches you to overemphasize your visual input. And so in his belief, it actually is counterproductive, because when you then get into a race car, you've trained yourself to ignore all of these other cues.
I can imagine that just from owning two different cars and going from one to the other, it actually takes you a conscious effort to adapt your driving from one to the other. So I can imagine if the simulation isn't absolutely perfect, then you would have that situation where, your muscle memory that you've developed for the simulator doesn't cross over perfectly to the real world.
Yeah, so it might be really good early on, but then loses relevance later. And in fairness, they're the applications that were being shown, right? These weren't simulations that an experienced radiographer or an experienced CT biopsier would be doing. This was really for students to get them to know what all the levers and buttons in the process was. But the Apple Pro is going to be really interesting because of that. It's sort of augmented reality, or they don't use that term, but it's got cameras all the way around. So you can imagine that you could potentially train radiographers in the room in your hospital with virtual patients, perhaps. I don't know. If anyone can get it to work, it's going to be Apple. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not even, you said you're not sure that projecting a 2D screen into the virtual space is going to be that useful. I think it actually will be. From what I've heard, the clarity of the Apple Vision Pro is such that it feels like you're looking at a screen. The text looks amazing. And, a lot of spaces where you're working, your screen is kind of limited in how big it can be.
Yeah, that's true.
And the ergonomics, you can position the screen wherever you like, sit in a nice kind of comfortable place. And also you can potentially get rid of screens entirely. So the cost of the actual screens themselves.
We could become true battery radiologists, like battery chickens. You just need a cubicle just big enough for a radiologist. You put a drip in our arm, caffeine, up to 5 p.m. Then you swap it over for a Negroni. You just report.
Look, I think that is potential. I think it could be. And if there's one thing that I think will, break through and make the VR AR headset a reality in terms of day-to-day life, it's work, because work is you looking at a screen usually on your own for an extended period of time, and you don't have the social problems because you're usually just working independently, right? Whereas any other application of this, wearing these goggles, is going to be a barrier to actual, interactions with other humans. So I think if they can nail the working at simulated screens, then I reckon it could be big.
And it's also true that our environments aren't great often. Like the room that we report in, it's not exactly a wonderful place to be in. And if you can have a virtual place on the side of the beach or some meadow somewhere with your beautiful desk, mahogany desk, and enormous monitors all around you, maybe that would be better.
Yeah, and more customized to you rather than having to adapt to everybody else in the room. No, I wonder. What about gaming though? You've done a bit of gaming in VR. I know we went to that. I think it's called Zero Latency here in Melbourne, which is like a warehouse where they've got cameras and you wear a VR headset and you can walk around the room. And there's that one bit where you kind of come up an elevator. Obviously you don't, but you feel like you've come up an elevator. The doors of the elevator open, and then there's like a little path across a big
that's
crevasse.
Amazing, right?
Yeah, and they blow a fan on you, so you really feel like you're actually going across and that you could fall down. That feels good. And then obviously you're killing zombies, because what else would you want to do in that kind
Awesome.
of
Yeah.
setting? So that was good. But have you ever done like VR at home? I've never really got into gaming at
Yeah,
home.
when the first PlayStation VR came out, I immediately got it and played with it for a while. And that fake screen in VR kind of works for gaming. I remember playing some 2D games on a massive, like a virtual theater screen instead of my normal TV. And that was interesting. The resolution at the time wasn't great. But the one thing that I realized was I'm just petrified of horror type games. I tried to play Resident Evil 4 that's set in some redneck mansion with, it's kind of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre thing. And the difference between using a controller to move the camera with your left thumb to look behind you versus having to actually turn your head to look around you, or to crouch to look under a trapdoor or something, that physicality of it was petrifying. And I got about 10% through the game, and it's like there is nothing about this that is fun. My adrenal glands are sort of squeezing themselves dry as I'm playing this. So got rid of it pretty soon. But I don't know. Again, often just a controller, after the first few minutes of playing a game, you actually forget whether you're looking at a screen or not.
Most people I've heard who've got into VR gaming only do it for a short period of time, and then they go back to more traditional handheld controller type gaming. So I'm not sure. That's why I wonder whether the actual work environment, creating simulated screens, is going to be the thing that breaks it through rather than gaming.
I was speaking to a friend of mine who mentors startups at one of the technical universities here in Melbourne. They have these days where people come and pitch ideas for new companies. Mm-hmm. And he was saying, oh my God, there's, again, for the fifth year in a row, someone comes up with the idea of cutting up used car tires and incorporating them in something, whether it's sleepers for railway stations or whether it's in tarmac for roads, etc. Mm-hmm. And showing that you can reuse these and they're environmentally friendly and they increase the longevity of the road or whatever item they put it in. And his comment was, that's not the hard part. The coming up with the idea is actually the really easy part. It's making it into a product or a company that actually works. That's the really challenging part. And that echoes what Elon Musk said about when he was ramping up the Tesla factories. He's like, building the car is 1,000 times easier than building the factory that builds the cars.
Yeah.
And integrating that into a company that is actually financially viable. And so putting on these headsets and showing a demo that is compelling is only the first 10% of the problem. It's, can you build a business around making it really good? Can you sell enough of these headsets to get buy-in? And if Apple's having a swing at it, I guess that means they think they can.
But you wonder whether a lot of the technology that they've come up for this will apply to other things anyway, even if this doesn't land, because the idea of 3D video is obviously going to happen in the future anyway. I wonder whether we'll get to the point where you actually have cameras in every room of your house that kind of video you throughout the day and can
every room, look Dixon.
At you. Yeah, for my OnlyFans. No, I just wonder whether that would be a thing, because the problem with the headset at the moment is that you put the headset on, but you can't actually have a camera facing back at yourself necessarily.
How nice would it be if we could get rid of consent forms? And if you recorded the conversation you had with the patient, then you wouldn't need to do all the paperwork, because the actual conversation,
it's been documented,
would be the thing, rather than a piece of paper that stands in for a conversation that may or may not have occurred.
No, I think I prefer the piece of paper, to be honest. Then you can just go, yeah, here you go. Here's the piece of paper.
Take your time to read it, but sign it right now.
Yeah, sign it right now. I'll just start scrubbing up while you're reading that. I remember quite a few years ago when one of my trainees was in like first year. He's now a fellow. He's really into kind of tech and these kind of things. And he got an ultrasound probe and got his smartphone, I think, and put it in as a little pair of goggles, and then put a little marker on the end of the cannula, and then he wrote a little program to, when you put your goggles on, the cannula was essentially like a lightsaber. You would get and you could just see when it came into plane on the ultrasound.
Right.
So, you could see that your laser wasn't there, and then you could see, zoop, oh, there's the laser going right into the blood vessel, and then you just keep going along that trajectory, and you're going to hit. And if the laser moves away, you're not quite on track. This was very, very accurate, and you were doing it just on a dummy, but it was amazing. And he did that. He just hacked that together.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that these things aren't happening from some of the big manufacturers, to be honest.
It's because it's 1,000 times harder. And it is disappointing, right? Because I spent time doing computer-aided diagnosis. I had a small lab where we did MS lesion detection, and we published a whole bunch of validation studies showing that it really helped. And we still use it at our hospital as part of an ongoing research thing. And it sped everyone up, and you feel much more confident that you're identifying new lesions using it. But getting a vendor to kind of develop it and go through the process of FDA approval, etc., is such a huge undertaking that a lot of this low-hanging fruit just isn't getting done. Instead, we're spending all our time answering questions that don't need to be answered most of the time. A lot of the AI research is on like detecting pseudoprogression versus true tumor progression, and they show that it's 90% effective or whatever. And it's like, well, you can be 90% effective even as a mediocre radiologist. That's not a really difficult problem. It's identifying the small aneurysm on a non-dedicated study that's would be having much bigger effect on patient outcomes, but you don't see those coming out as quickly as I would have thought they would have come out. So there's incentives there that distort. Just whether something is good doesn't mean it's going to happen, unfortunately. And that's where I'm a bit pessimistic about VR in training in radiology.
We should have got someone on the podcast who was not pessimistic about it to go to have a conversation with you. But unfortunately, I agree too much with you this week. So we've kind of just gone into a very negative space, but we better wrap it up. So how, in a very negative way, how can people get in contact with us, Frank?
Well, if you absolutely must get in contact with us, you can
Please
do
don't.
so at Radiopedia on Twitter and at Instagram, as well as at Frank Gaylard and Andrew Dixon. Oh, sorry, it's Dr. Andrew Dixon, isn't it?
But just whatever.
Don't do it.
Do whatever.
We're not going to answer. So, And you can email us at podcast@radiopedia.org with ideas and feedback, or just, negative feedback, just downers, just things that you don't like.
But I tell you what's exciting. Radiopedia 2023 is coming up in 2 weeks' time. Here we go. Now we're getting excited.
Well, that is 1,000 times harder, but we're actually doing it, and it'll be awesome.
Yeah, it's actually happening. So that's one way you can support us, actually, is by becoming a supporter and an all-access pass holder on the website, and you get to attend the conference with that. And in doing so, you're also helping us to give free access to the conference and to all our courses to people in 125 low and middle-income countries. So that's exciting. And what else can people do to help us out, Frank?
Well, you can also leave a 1-star review. No. A 5-star review in the podcast app of your choosing.
Yes, excellent. All right, should we? I want to hear you stay rad today. This will be great. This will be.
Really?
I want the most depressing Frank Gaylard. AI is terrible. Augmented reality is crap. That's what I want.
I want diminished reality where you can, remove things from around you, not add things in.
Yeah. Just go into a complete 2-dimensional space.
Yeah, that's right.
And we'll catch you all again sometime soon in the reading room.
Stay rad. Stay rad. If you have to, you can stay rad. You don't have to, though.
Should we do this again next week or not, mate?
Don't know.
I suppose we better.
I'm going to have a drink.
See ya.
Bye.